heard it before, but I've never paid that much attention to the words, but it does fit so well with our lesson tonight. We are going to be finishing up the first chapter of Proverbs. If you want to go ahead and open your books to Proverbs chapter 1, we will be continuing in verse 20. And this proverb is in many ways the story of my life. This past week, Daniel and I went over and had lunch with Randy Schilling, the new preacher over at the Davenport Church. And as we're sitting there eating lunch, he asked me, he said, "Where are you from?" And I said, "Texas." And he said, "Where in Texas?" And I told him a little town called Sonora. You probably never heard of it. He said, "I know exactly where it is." He said, "My wife was from Midland." I said, "You're kidding." He said, "Yeah." He said, "And we met at Texas Tech through their student ministry there in Lubbock." And I said, that is wild. I said, I was born in Lubbock. My mom still lives in Lubbock. He said, "Yeah, we attended the Broadway Church of Christ there." And I said, "I knew some folks that attended the Broadway Church of Christ in Lubbock." And he was naming some of the people that he knew there, some of the people who had really inspired his life. And there was one family named Evans. And I kind of vaguely recognized the first names of this couple, but it's like this very faint bell going off in the back of your brain. And so I was thinking a little bit, and I said, I used to work with a guy at my grandparents' lumberyard. As soon as I said, worked with a guy at the lumberyard, he got this look on his face. And I said, "Yeah, my grandparents owned a lumberyard there, and I worked with a guy named Richard Evans." And he sat there and stared at me for a while, and he said, "Richard Evans is my best friend." I said, "The same Richard Evans that ended up opening his own pet store there?" And he said, "Yeah, Pets Plus." I said, "Yeah." He said, "In fact, we are so close that when we were growing up and having our kids, if something happened to me and my wife, Richard and his wife would raise our kids." He said, "We did family vacations together." He said, "Richard and I go way back." And I thought, that is so cool. And at the same time, I thought, oh, no. Because, like I shared with him and Daniel, that time when I was working at the lumberyard there, when I knew Richard very well, and some of you may have heard this name before, because I've actually used Richard as a sermon illustration before, about a guy who had a tremendous impact on my life, not because he came and preached at me, but just because of the life he lived and the way he tried to kind of influence me through things he said. But that was probably the most pagan period in my life. I'm going to share with you what I shared with them that I've never really shared with a whole lot of people before. I was 19 years old at this time when I was working there with Richard at the lumberyard. My girlfriend was 32. And it was not a good relationship. In fact, I had Richard drive me one time in the lumber truck to stop by her house so we could pick up some pot. That's how bad my life was at that period. And in reading through this proverb and all of those memories coming back, and he told me, he said, "Yeah, Richard will be up here someday," because they visit us several times a year. And I thought, great. Yeah. But I told him, I said, "I do want to see Richard," because he did have a big influence in my life, not because of the way he sat me down and preached to me, but just the life that he lived. And there was something in the life that Richard lived that at a different point in my life, I wanted that. Didn't really know what it was, but I wanted it. You see, that period of my life, I was what the Bible would consider a mocker, or I like the word scoffer a little better. We're going to get to it in a little bit, because I was one of these people, if somebody tried to tell me what I needed to be doing right with my life, I was, yeah, right. I don't need your Bible stuff. I don't need your Jesus stuff. I believe in God. I pray when I need to, but I stand on my own 2 feet. I was also a fool Because a fool is someone who doesn't ever want to grow up. I decided that I was 19 and I was going to be 19 for the rest of my life. Going to be just as happy and carefree as I could be at that point in my life. And I tried to stay 19 for several years. And I think I told you that all the people that I looked up to in those years, and I wanted that free, easy lifestyle that was just nothing but fun and games. When I noticed all of their teeth were falling out, they didn't have anybody as friends except their dogs and the people they partied with. You know, I started realizing at some point in time that my life was missing something. And I found myself at rock bottom. It seemed like every decision I made turned out to be the wrong decision. And I didn't know what to do to make it any better. Because what I would usually do is I would make a decision, it would turn bad, but then rather than turn to someone else and say, what's the best way to handle this decision, I would just add on to that by making another stupid decision. And then things would just get worse. And I would just keep making these stupid decision after stupid decision after stupid decision until finally I'm washing my laundry in the bathtub of my apartment one night because I couldn't afford to take it down to the laundry. And I thought, God, if you're there, I need some help. And I started looking back in my life at the people who were in hard situations and knew how to handle them in a good way without just turning around and making another stupid decision and another stupid decision. Richard was one of those people. Even though he was only a few years older than me, when Richard found himself in some hardships, and I had seen this in his life, rather than panic and do something stupid, he seemed to have a way of just trusting that God was going to take care of things. And therefore, he could just kind of go on and do the right thing. The other person that was like that in my life was my grandfather. I mentioned him this morning. How he, when faced with a tough decision, he would stop and he would think about it. And eventually he would come up with how he was going to handle it. And it was always a way that was based upon God. And so when I'm at this low point in my life and I started looking for these people and what it was that they had in their life that gave them the stability to handle whatever life threw at them and stay on that even plane, the thing that they all had in common was God. And what I have learned in studying this proverb, what they actually had was wisdom. They weren't necessarily the smartest people, but they had wisdom. And I came to realize that that's what I needed in my life, was biblical wisdom. And as we go through Proverbs chapter 1, beginning in verse 20, I want to share with you how this proverb is the story of my life, but not only that, but how you, in gaining wisdom, can have a tremendous impact on those around you. The proverb begins, or this part of the poem begins saying, wisdom calls out in the street. She raises her voice in the public squares. At the head of the noisy street, she cries out. In the gateways of the city, she makes her speech. Now, wisdom here is personified as this woman, and we sense in this the urgency that she has. She sees people out there who are fools, they're simple, they're mockers, they're scoffers, and yet they need what she has to offer. And so she goes throughout the entire city trying to find these people, trying to gain them, trying to win them back, trying to get them to hear and to understand. And the places that she goes were not the places that a woman would typically go in that time period and make herself known. Women didn't go into the city squares and be yelling and stuff. They didn't go to the gates of the city, and yet these are the places where she goes. We have to picture in our mind a woman who has lost her child. when Dory and I first met, we were down at Tulsa at the workshop one year. We were all kind of coming back together. We were going to go to lunch, and everybody was supposed to meet at a certain place at a certain time. How many of you have been to the Tulsa workshop? So you know how big and how many people there are there. So everybody gets back together, and we're kind of going around deciding what we're going to do. And all of a sudden we realize that Tasha is not there. Tasha was 12 at the time, or 11 at the time. You want to know of a woman that went crazy in a public place, yelling and screaming, looking for her lost daughter. And that's the woman that we see in Proverbs. There's an urgent call for people to gain wisdom. But she goes on and she now enters into a conversation. She says, how long will you simple ones love your simple ways? The Hebrew word that's translated simple there is one that means that people without moral direction and that are inclined to evil. And in some ways, I wasn't quite like, I wouldn't describe myself as without moral direction. I knew the difference between right and wrong. And I wasn't inclined to evil. The problem is that I was, like I said, more one of these scoffers or mockers. How long will mockers delight in mockery? And I don't really like the NIV's translation into mockers, not because it's wrong, but to me someone who mocks is someone who makes fun of someone else, or someone who repeats what you say back and things like that. I like the word scoffer better, because a scoffer is somebody that, like I said earlier, says, I don't need that. And that was me. How long will scoffers delight in scoffing? And fools hate knowledge. I don't want anybody to tell me I have to grow up. I don't want anybody to tell me what I'm doing wrong. I'm having fun. If you had responded to my rebuke, wisdom says, I would have poured out my heart to you, made my thoughts known to you. And we're going to notice here the way that wisdom tries and desires and wants to reach out and instill something into us. And as we get to the end, we'll see what it is that wisdom has for us if we'll just open to her. Going on in verse 24. Lord, there's this kind of play here between what you did and what she offered. But since you rejected me when I called, and no one gave heed when I stretched out my hand, since you ignored my advice and would not accept my rebuke. Notice that. Rejected, gave no heed, ignored, did not accept. But notice what Lady Wisdom was. She calls, stretches out her hands, gives advice, offers rebuke. Yet all of that was rejected. And so, since I rejected that, Lady Wisdom says in verse 26, I in turn will laugh at your disaster. I will scoff and mock when calamity overtakes you. When calamity overtakes you like a storm, when disaster sweeps over you and over you like a whirlwind, when distress and troubles overwhelm you, she says, I'm going to mock. Now I want you to understand, this is not God speaking here. This is the wisdom of God speaking here, but I don't want you to see this as if God is saying, I'm just going to laugh it up when you stumble. Because that's not what's going on. This is wisdom. Lady Wisdom speaking this. I in turn will laugh at your disaster. I'll mock when calamity overtakes you. When overtakes you like a storm, when disaster sweeps over you like a whirlwind, when distress and troubles overwhelm you. And then you'll call to me, but I will not answer. They will look for me, but will not find me, since they hated knowledge and did not choose the fear of the Lord. Since they would not accept my advice and spurn my rebuke, they will eat the fruit of their ways and be filled with the fruit of their schemes. Now, I want to stop right there. This is a description of the way life goes when you make stupid mistakes because you don't have wisdom. And since you haven't sought wisdom in the past, you don't even know where to turn to make the right decision, which means that the bad decision you made leads to another bad decision, which leads to another bad decision, which leads to another bad decision. And wisdom just laughs. You're never going to get out of this on your own. Because, verse 29, you hated knowledge and you did not choose to fear the Lord. You see, I think that's the key to all that there is in wisdom. That's the key that those men in my life who influenced me, they had chosen to fear the Lord. As we talked about this morning, that was their driving motivation, their driving thought. I want to live my life for God. Which means that sometimes I have to stop and think about, okay, how would God want me to act in this situation? What would He want me to do? In church, when we get to where that's the way our life is lived, that's wisdom. They accept knowledge. We want to know more. We want to know, how does God view these things? And that's what drives us to study His Word. That's what drives us to seek a relationship with Him. And those things are what wisdom is really all about. Verse 32 wraps all this up. For the waywardness of the simple will kill them, and the complacency of fools will destroy them. And I can tell you, church, from personal experience, that's a true statement. As long as we remain wayward and just drifting and going wherever life carries us, we'll die. As long as we can remain complacent about who we are, never really wanting to be any different, never really wanting to be any better, it'll destroy us. But, verse 33, whoever listens to me will live in safety and be at ease without fear of harm. And you see, that's what I saw in these other men. They lived in safety. They didn't really have to worry and panic when things went bad, because God was in charge. They didn't really have to get upset and react to everything that came along, because they knew God was in charge. They lived in safety. They lived a life of ease. They weren't stressed about everything. You know, I told you my grandfather owned a lumber business. Do you think everybody was always building homes in West Texas back in the 40s and 50s and 60s? No. There were, housing busts, and there were housing booms, and there were times when they were making good money, and there were times when they didn't know how they were going to fill up the truck to deliver the next load of lumber. But you know what kept him going? He knew God was in charge of everything. And church, that's the wisdom that Lady Wisdom calls us to have. And I know, again, these are Proverbs written for young people younger than us, okay? But these are lessons that we can always learn. Because I'm going to tell you from personal experience, it wasn't a sermon that converted me to God. It wasn't somebody sitting down and explaining to me how I needed to be in order to come to God. It was people who lived with this wisdom that when I hit bottom, I wanted what they had. And that is what drew me into a relationship with God. St. Francis of Assisi is credited with making this statement: preach the gospel always, and when necessary, use words. These men preached to me without their words. but because of their lives. Who in your life are you influencing because of the way you live? Because of the wisdom you have? And I want us to be thinking about that, church, because I began, when I first said I was going to be preaching through the Proverbs, I think we need more sages in our world today. Men and women of wisdom, who just by the way they live and the faith they have, preach loud messages. So tonight, I want to encourage all of you to seek wisdom, to hear her call, to grow in that lifestyle. And if there's anything we can do to help you in this, please come forward while we stand and sing this song.